Ladies and gentlemen, get ready. He's the tornado from Indianapolis. It is the one, the only George Hornedo. Hey, everybody, and welcome to Political Playlist Happy Hour. I'm Michael Kristof.
I'm Anna Muskie-Goldwyn.
And I guess if this doesn't work out, I can go do like amateur boxing match.
Yeah, you got like a good announcer voice there.
Like that was I couldn't help myself because we are talking to the politician on our playlist this week, and that is George Hornedo. We got clarity. His name does in fact rhyme with Hornedo, with tornado, and it is pronounced as such. And this guy is running for Congress in Indianapolis area. In obviously Indiana is the state.
Wow, you're so smart with your geography.
Yeah, and it's like it's sort of there. It's over in that place.
Oh, God.
We know it. We know it from Notre Dame, obviously, Notre Dame football, which we hate. Go Trojans. And we also know it from South Bend Mayor Pete, which we love. So it's and then Mike Pence, who we're sort of, on the fence about. So I'd say
wow.
We're 1-1-1 on
we've
Indiana.
We've gone down a real Indiana rabbit hole here. But It's interesting that you bring up Mayor Pete because
yes.
George, who is running in Indiana's 7th district, which includes Indianapolis, he not only is a lawyer, a political strategist who worked in the Obama administration, but he also worked on Pete Buttigieg's 2020 presidential campaign when Pete Buttigieg was only 37 years old. Pretty significant for a young person now stepping into their own campaign. And George he's interesting because he's running as this younger sort of like, quote, outsider Democrat. But I actually think he might disagree with that positioning as an outsider because he has spent his entire career working in politics, consulting in politics, being a lawyer, sort of adjacent to the political world. And so I think he is part of this class of young people in these primary challenges who are, quote, outsiders, but do have this like real political experience on the inside to stand on and understand the things that they're trying to tackle. And he needs it because he is running against a 15-year incumbent named Andre Carson. Representative Andre Carson was elected in 2008, and he was actually elected in a special election to replace his grandmother, Julia Carson, following her death, who held the seat since 1997. So needless to say,
a bit of a family affair.
And the ties to this seat do run quite deep. And so it's he's part of this series we're doing called Primary Watch, where we're talking to primary challengers, young people who are stepping into competitive races, both, Republicans, Democrats challenging other Democrats in the primary, people who are looking to unseat Republicans in competitive districts, all of the above, because we're seeing that there is this like groundswell, specifically on the left, of wanting a new generation and new ideas and fresh faces in Congress. And I think that George is really emblematic of that. And we talk a lot about his approach to campaigning and how he's trying to stand out in the face of an incumbent who does have a lot of weight within the district already, but he's doing really well. And their primary actually is on May 5th. So it's down to the wire for them.
Well, and we get into a little bit about all of the hurdles that the Democratic Party put in the way of George. And I think it's interesting. You just said, yes, on the one hand, he kind of takes issue with, being labeled an outsider because he's not quite an outsider. But at the same time, he, during this campaign, as we'll get into in this conversation, the establishment, as it were, very much boxed him out of a lot of just very practical things that you need in order to run a successful campaign. So very great conversation. And I guess, should we just get to that convo now?
Let's get to the tornado, baby.
Let's do it. All right, George Hornedo, welcome to Political Playlist Happy Hour. Good to be with you.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
We are definitely a little early in the morning here, so I'm on water and coffee. We're not in our normal happy hour having a cocktail vibe, but I'm still very excited to talk to you today.
No, absolutely. I'm a couple Celsiuses and myself
Oh
for the
my
day.
God.
But
There
There
we
you
go.
go. I feel like, I mean, so your primary is what day exactly is the primary?
It is on Tuesday, May 5th, and
Okay,
early
so
voting is underway right now.
got a
so it
Cinco
has
de
been for
Mayo
2 weeks.
primary.
Exactly.
That's great.
Chugging your Celsius. It's go time.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's going to be a margarita night,
Celsius-
regardless of
Yeah.
Totally. Exactly. I feel like there should
That's
be
great.
some sort of like partnership between young people running for office and Celsius drinks. I feel like that's like a
absolutely.
missed opportunity on their part.
Yeah.
Look, I'll put #ad on any post. It's fine. with
That'd
me.
be great. Yeah, totally.
Love it.
Well, so you are running in the primary for Indiana's 7th congressional district. You're running against a guy who has been there for a while. I want to just sort of dive in with your campaign vision here and the slogan "Climb," which stands for courage, leadership, integrity, movement, belief. And this is great. These are obviously important qualities. But can you explain how they embody what you're hoping to do as a future congressman?
No, I love the question. I actually haven't gotten it before, and it's something that's
Really?
very meaningful to me in the campaign, right? And I'm actually looking, I've got my whiteboard right here, and I have it to kind of center everything. And when getting into this campaign, there are a lot of things that I thought about of like, what's the ethos of this that I want to kind of put forward and not just have it be another cookie cutter, sort of race. And so we've done a lot of things differently than what traditionally are the case in campaigns. And one of the things I think a lot about is when I was working for Pete Buttigieg, he had his rules of the road, right? And so I thought about what's my equivalent. And so early on at the beginning of the campaign, I didn't want it to be kind of top down, just like I don't want to go about any of this in a top down manner. And so, that was built with some of the volunteers, on the team, right? And thinking about what are we trying to push forward. And one of the things that I talk a lot about is that I can't blame anybody for being disillusioned in this moment. I mean, every time I open up Twitter or turn on the TV, it's like, what new terrible thing is happening, right now? And so it's sobering, but when I'm on the doors, when I'm on the phones, with folks, I see something else, right? I see the challenges, I see all of that, but I also see the resilience, right? I also see, the hope, and I see the courage, the leadership, the integrity, the movement, the belief, right? And so the choices between, step away and step up, I'm always going to choose to step up. I mean, running for Congress is an extreme way of doing so. So that doesn't have to be right an approach everybody takes. But voting is stepping up, right? Going to some of these neighborhood house parties that folks are organizing, that's stepping up. Just being in community in different ways, right? I think that there's a decrease in the quote unquote third place of where people spend their time outside of work and home. And to me, the biggest issue in our politics before you even get to message or messenger or policy is an erosion of trust in our leaders, in our parties, in the systems and institutions that continue to fail us. And I don't think you solve that, top down with TV ads. I think you solve it in community. I think you solve it with presence by showing up. And it's why, we've been organizing year round. We've built the largest, Democratic field operation, that the state has seen in years. We've knocked on over 42,000 doors. We've made over 1.5 million direct voter outreach attempts. We've had individual conversations with over 16,000 voters, one-on-one. That's separate and apart from community events, from house parties, from social media, earned media, and so on. And so it gives a bit of a heat map, not just on the issues that people are facing, but you get a sense of what they really want and what they're hungry for. And we all just want to climb out of this mess that we're in, and we got to do it together.
I love that. I mean, you mentioned disillusionment, and I think like there's certainly disillusionment with sort of everything as a whole right now. But I also think from a lot of people within the Democratic Party, there's a sense of disillusionment with maybe the way the party has been operating. And when we look to this vision of yours, these words that, again, I'll just repeat: courage, leadership, integrity, movement, belief. How do you feel like, as a outsider, a new person coming into the party, how can you change change the way the party is working so that those elements come back into it? Because I think for a lot of young people, they've been missing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's no better time to reshape the party than now, right? In the same way that Trump reshaped it, 10 years ago. I also believe that we can't fix what we refuse to face. I'm a Democrat. Yes. My whole career's been, in national Democratic politics, but, in my mind, parties, what they're supposed to be are vehicles that, from their differing perspectives, yes, functionally exist to elect candidates, but for what larger purpose? For serving people, right? I think what we've actually seen them become are vehicles to preserve the power and influence of those already in leadership. And, I'm not the rebel from outside throwing rocks in. I'm from inside the house saying it's on fire. For 5 years leading up into getting into this race, I was on the board of the state Democratic Party here. I'm then forced off the board after getting into this race, right?
Wow.
I was denied access without cause, by the state party to the voter file, which I need to actually reach folks, and that was despite the DNC chair and the DNC CEO and David Hogg and others trying to get involved, saying that this was inappropriate. But there was no authority, from the DNC over state parties in this regard. And so the party just ignored it.
Wow.
And so that meant that, I had to get the voter file directly from the vendor at 7 times the expense, which for, scrappy, grassroots campaign like ours, and as a first-time candidate, that's meaningful, right? This is one of 2 primary challenges, in the country that Hakeem Jeffries donated to the incumbent. This is, I believe, still the only primary challenge in which a member of House Democratic leadership and Minority Whip Catherine Clark has come to the district to defend the incumbent. There are all the traditional rooms of which I would typically have kind of an audience in, I'm being blocked out of, right? Wow. There's a township Democratic club that did invite me, to be one of their invited monthly speakers. And before I went up to speak, the president of it said, "Hey, everybody, I want to address the elephant in the room." When we invited George and announced him, a lot of y'all wanted to boycott this and wanted to disinvite him. But that's not what we do here. This is an open forum. He's running. He should have the ability to talk to people.
Wow.
And this doesn't mean it's an endorsement or a lack thereof. And so I thanked him because he did something that a lot of these other kind of institutional groups, are doing, which is giving me that opportunity. And so we spoke to the group, and I had over half that room, and these are party stalwarts. And I had this one woman come to me afterwards and say, "You know what? I was part of that group he was referencing, and you got me. Can I get a yard sign?"
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
That's
well,
rewarding.
Okay. So I want to ask you more about this because this is so interesting. So you're running against Representative Andre Carson, who, quite frankly, I had never heard of.
Yeah.
And he has been in Congress since 2008. So it seems like, just based on what you're saying, that the leadership is really nervous about you gaining a lot of ground, possibly unseating him in a primary challenge, which you're attempting to do. What do you think you're doing that is helping you break through as this first-time candidate, as the outsider who's been shut out? And it seems like it's effective. So what are you doing to get people so rattled?
To get that yard sign in that person's yard.
I mean, in terms of the rattled, I think it's the reality that I understand the system, right? I mean, some people look at my background and having worked, within it, and they say it's disingenuous, the way in which I'm an outsider in this. The reality is, like, I don't even think of myself as insider versus outsider so much as I am like somebody that's trying to get results. Right. I have been able to work within, the systems and the halls of power, which is beneficial because those that I think are always needing to be closest to power are actually furthest from it. But I've never quite felt like I fit in, within it. And the incentive is to go along to get along. But if I feel like something is failing people, I'm going to say something. I'm going to, try and change it and adjust and use my voice and and take up space. And I don't apologize for that. Right. And so, it's a bit of a, unique, kind of background to then take on this approach. But I think that it means that there's all the more credibility because I understand it and what's not working. Right. I think that, like I said, we can't fix what we refuse to face. And, we're very tribal in our politics right now. We're just reflexively, anti the other side, regardless. And, look, it's not to say that there's no shortage of issues, that I have with the Republican Party right now. But, we've got to hold the mirror up to ourselves as Democrats as well. And I am also by no means a both sides type of person, but working as close as I have, federal, state, and local levels, we have to tell the truth that too many, not all, but too many of our elected officials, regardless of party, are not doing the job. It has become more about status. It has become a jobs program of such rather than public service, which is what it's supposed to be.
I love that. I mean, also you're in a pretty red state, despite being in a blue, area. I think that that's also a unique position that we find a lot of members of Congress in, where the one that comes to mind is Sharice Davids in Kansas is the only Democrat in that state that if elected, you're going to have a lot of Republican colleagues from Indiana that you have to, talk to and deal with. But I did notice, I wanted to bring up, I saw on your Instagram that you were essentially trying to challenge Representative Carson to a debate. And I'm just curious, like, and it makes more sense now hearing you talk about the way that this has sort of all been playing out. Is that happening? Is like what is going on with that?
When I first got into the race, CNN came and did a story on it, and they asked him whether he would do a debate or a panel, and he said he was open to it, right? But he's not doing a damn thing. I mean, he doesn't show up. At best, he'll send a staffer to candidate panels. Even for the Indiana Democratic African American Caucus, which you would think would be the friendliest audience, they canceled that because I was the only candidate to confirm my participation. And so he doesn't even want to give folks the ability to see. And I think it's because he knows that he can't stand on his own record.
Wow.
And when you're talking about being this is the only we have another Democratic member of Congress in Northwest Indiana, but that's a competitive seat. This is the only safe Democratic seat in the congressional delegation. So there are some issues, policy differences that have surfaced in this race between the congressman and I, around data centers, around ICE overreach. But by and large, this is a safe Democratic seat, so you're going to have a safe Democratic vote. So my qualms with the congressman are less around his voting record than how he does or doesn't use the platform, right? So effectiveness is a big piece. As much as I respect him personally, we got to tell the truth. The Center for Effective Lawmaking, a nonpartisan institute, consistently ranks him in the bottom 10% in legislative effectiveness for all members of Congress. 18 years in office, 2 bills signed into law, both ceremonial, renaming a federal building and naming a memorial. We lag behind peer cities across the country in how much federal funding we've been able to bring home. In my professional life and private practice, I've represented Birmingham, Jackson, Little Rock, Miami-Dade County, the African American Mayors Association, and it brought a lot of money to those communities. So I know how to do that side of things. But also when his grandmother was in this seat, this was the best district in the state in voter turnout. And that's when we had more balanced government and Democrats were competing, even winning statewide. This is now the worst district in the state in voter turnout under his tenure.
Wow.
In a state that already ranks dead last. So to me, for Indy to be one of the least engaged places politically, certainly least engaged, larger cities, politically in the country is both embarrassing, and it doesn't have to be that way. Republicans have an inherent 9-point advantage, but they're winning by 20 plus points because we're not organized here in Indy. And they feel so comfortable. They're putting up the craziest of the crazies as their, candidates, the sorts of people that we otherwise should be able to compete with and even beat. There are 15 states more conservative, based off the data than Indiana. And 4 or 5 of them, like Kansas, with Governor Kelly, have more recently had, statewide Democratic electeds. So I fundamentally believe that we can get there, but it starts with refueling the engine that is Indianapolis to power that Democratic growth.
I was just going to say, I mean, just on that point of Indianapolis, it's like you're in one of these cities that I feel is so exemplary of what people are looking to, of kind of what is the future of like the American city really going to be, like Michael and I, we're the typical coastal elites. We're from the New York suburbs and we live in Los Angeles. So we don't have much ground to stand on when it comes to cities like yours. But what I think is so fascinating is that a place like Indianapolis is, I think, like one of these kind of shining examples of how are we going to look at like what the quote American city is and will become. And I think a lot of cities in the Midwest have that opportunity. And so it is really, it's so disheartening and frustrating. And I'm sure you share that to know that like people are not as engaged as they should be politically when they're in a position where they can really be shaping the future of what the country is going to look like and feel like from an urban perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, think about Obama won in 08, right? Like I really do believe that, while not overnight, we can build back to a place where, we're a place of, we're not just seen as flyover country, that people actually, that we matter politically, right? And that affects things in a whole bunch of different ways. Downstream benefits, from a federal perspective, more money coming in for elections so we get better, public servants here. Like it's all extremely important. But right now it just feels very much both from a political and a policy side, that we're left behind. And so that's why I'm kind of encouraged right now. We're 2 weeks into early voting. And at this stage of early voting, it's 130% more votes than in 2024.
That's amazing.
112% more than in 2022. And for those that want to say that, it's just national mood, it's 30% more than the 2018 Trump midterm. So what that tells me is that, this is what a competitive primary does, right? This is what year-round organizing does. And I think while that's encouraging, what's most interesting to me is the makeup of those that have already voted thus far. 47% did not vote in the 2022 midterm primary.
Wow.
And 26% have not voted in a primary at all, or at least not in this decade. So this is rebuilding the electorate, in real time. And obviously we'll see how it holds through election day and everything, but it's, this is exactly what we were hoping to do.
That's so amazing and very cool.
You had mentioned earlier when I was asking about the climb motto, about having worked with Pete Buttigieg, and you worked with him on his 2020 presidential campaign. Obviously another Indiana darling. And, I'm curious, like, what can you talk a little bit about what you saw from working on that campaign, what you saw him implement that you've used? Because it seems like you are going about this your campaign very strategically, very smart, and you're taking nothing for granted. You've built this year-round campaign, and obviously the numbers you just spoke of, I think, are indicative of that. So I'm wondering just if you could share a little bit about what that experience gave you as far as preparing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it was definitely a transformative experience, and think very highly of Pete. I mean, this was, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, running for president, right? It was quite the swing. I mean, just like a first-time candidate trying to take on an 18-year incumbent who comes from who has a legacy of 50 years of service in the community. So it's quite the swing, but it's doing so because feeling like things can be better, and not just that things can be better, but what I really admire about Pete is his systems lens and way in which he views about things. And of course the campaign then took shape in all sorts of different ways, but earlier on it felt very like out of West Wing, like it was an Aaron Sorkin sort of campaign. He's out here talking about democracy reform, right? How forward looking he was on that, right? And so it's important because Republicans have always done a much better job at thinking ahead. None of this happened overnight. It didn't even happen just with Project 2025. This is decades of work, Federalist Society, Heritage Foundation, trying to get state legislatures, get as many governorships as possible, working the court system, gerrymandering, and so on and so on. And we're always a little bit behind, right? Right now Democrats are figuring out how to go viral on social media while Republicans are buying the platforms that control the algorithms, right? And so it's that lens through which he brings to our politics. And one of the things I talk a lot about right now, and I'm seeing Pete start to talk about in some of his speeches, is the idea that this country is going to need a whole new reconstruction on the other side of Trump. I think right now there's often the conversation is the split within the party being progressive versus moderate, or economic populism versus abundance, which to me is so dumb because no normal person knows what abundance is. Like, give me a break, or young versus old, or even the fighter versus folder piece is like cute but surface level, right? Mm-hmm. I think the real split in the party is between those, which I think most elected officials now fall within, but those people that believe our systems and institutions largely work for people, and we simply need to protect them and manage this period of decline, versus those like myself that, of course, I'd rather not have everything be dismantled the way that it is. But the reality is, if this chaos brings about an opportunity to rebuild, then what are we building towards? I don't think not only that we can go back, but I don't think that we should go back to what we had, because it wasn't sufficiently meeting and serving the needs of people. Because if it were, then Trump wouldn't have been able to exploit people's anxieties and fears and so on to get back into office. And so I think we need to be able to reimagine, what government looks like and how to actually make it work for people, and rebuild that trust, right? And so that also lends itself to a whole new type of leader and a whole new type of elected that I think we need in this moment, which are builders. We don't need show horses. We need workhorses. We don't need people that are just kind of towing the line and doing what Democratic leadership wants. We need people actually thinking about what are the needs of their own community, and how are people not being served, and how do we solve for that?
I think that's great. I mean, I feel like when you talk about that idea of rebuilding, there's obviously so many different issues that come to mind. And one that pops into my head that I was reading you've been very involved in is looking at climate and sustainability. And I think this is something that's become so, politicized for many reasons. But I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about your experience, both public and private, working in climate and sustainability, and what, sort of what that was like, and how you're kind of ushering that into your campaign.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in private practice, Jackson, Mississippi was one of the cities I represented. So was part of a team that helped secure federal funds during their water crisis, right? And that's a canary in the coal mine, right? That can happen plenty of communities, right? So that's, one thing. Also represented Miami-Dade County was the lead entity for a larger consortium of, different the city of Miami, other counties in South Florida, economic development organizations, regional universities, private sector partners, and so on, that successfully got $20 million out of the CHIPS and Science Act from the regional technology and innovation hubs. And that hub specifically is on sustainable, resilient infrastructure, right? Which obviously a huge need, for South Florida. And so, these are issues that are not going away. I also think that it's an issue that's really important how we talk about it, right? And I think about that a lot generally in our politics. How do we speak about things in ways that bring more people into the fold? So with, I've got my fair shot agenda, each with 5 different, policy buckets, a slew of different, positions within each one. And one of those buckets is a sustainable future. If I lead with talking about environmental, health, environmental benefits, if I say the word environmental justice, it's like, oh my gosh, right? It makes a lot of people just stop listening. If I lead with lowering household cost, if I lead with, clean energy jobs, right? Does that bring more people into the fold to then they tune in to the rest of what I'm saying and talking about, right? And you can cross apply that, to anything. I mean, for me, the fair shot agenda is undergirded in the idea that poverty is the single biggest, most shameful policy failure in this country. And I see poverty not as a specific issue so much as it is a lens and a framework by which to look at everything else, right? Whether it be, environmental justice, whether it be, economic development and job creation, housing and urban development, health and educational outcomes and inequities, right? And, you talk about crime and public safety. You should care about, poverty, because while there's certainly bad people that regardless of their circumstances will do bad things, you can't tell me most crime is not crime of desperation. So what are we doing on the front end to enable people to live lives of, dignity and success, whatever that may look like, right? Or if you're a business owner that cares about a skilled workforce, then, what are we doing to educate and train, kids growing up here in Indiana to enter that skilled workforce, but not just to enter it, but to enter it here and not have the problem of brain drain that we have here right now. Right. And then, all right, what's one of the contributing factors to that problem? Some of our social policies, right? So all of these things are interconnected. And I think too often when we talk about, policy, we have it in silos, and we need to break those silos down and allow people to see their self-interest in issues that they don't think afflict them.
That's
well,
really
I think
interesting.
a lot of young candidates and congressmen and women that we've talked to are really starting to do that with climate. As you talked about it, the minute you start to frame it as an economic issue, all of a sudden people pay attention. So I'm curious, as you're doing that and realizing, oh, that's how you don't lose people in this conversation. Have you seen that be effective? And like the woman you talked about who came up after the meeting and asked for a sign, have you started to see that turn in people in your area when you speak of climate?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And not, necessarily climate per se, but environmental, issues at large, right? So one of the things, as is happening around the country is this fight around, data centers, right? It's a strain on, the power grid, the use of water, what it does to neighborhoods, right? And there's a big fight right now in this one area of town, large, a Black population, in a neighborhood that often feels unseen and unheard, right? And it's a $500 million project that they've been, fighting against. And so I was proud to stand with the community in opposition to it. And I'm going to one of their events tonight. And I was looking around everywhere to see what the congressman's statement, was on it. And he hadn't said anything until the day of, where he said it's an opportunity for the community to be heard, at this zoning hearing. And then after it passed, he feigned concern around it, all while some of his top financial backers were there in the front row in support of it, right? And so this is a community worried about all the different, environmental risks, as well, and it's something that they're just ignored. And it's awful. And utility costs, I am hearing from everybody across the city,
right?
At just how rapidly, they're rising. And BlackRock just acquired, our provider here, AES. And so that is, a huge issue. And, the congressman, again, while feigning concern around that, takes money from both entities.
Right.
And so it's one of those things where accountability is also important. And so I'm proud, to be 100% funded by individuals, 80% of which is small dollar donations. You compare that to the congressman, and 73% of his funds, come from PACs, much of it corporate PACs like BlackRock and AES and defense contractors. Only 7% are small dollar donors. And it's interesting that it is me as a first-time candidate, grassroots, that has 4 times as many in-district donors as an 18-year incumbent who comes from a 50-year legacy, right? And I think, people are very wary about who's actually working for them, versus who's just kind of giving the lip service, when it's too late. And, kind of to your point, earlier, Michael, when you said that you hadn't heard of the congressman, he's been there 18 years. So to not be heard of is very telling, right? And, and that's kind of my whole point, that we don't often get proactive leadership from him. At best, we get reactive leadership, but way too often we get silence.
You mentioned this idea of cost, which seems to be the thing that everyone feels, whatever tax bracket you're in, it doesn't matter at this point. But when you talk to people in your community about affordability, and I am doing air quotes for people who are listening and watching this, because I, as a voter, someone very politically engaged, I find myself often, I don't know if frustrated is the word, but it's kind of like the idea of affordability is such a big concept. And so when the word is kind of thrown around as like the issue, I'm sort of like, okay, but there's all these other things within it. And so for you in your district, you talk a lot about community. What does the affordability crisis look like in Indianapolis? And what do you hear from people are their needs and how you can address them?
I love that you made that point, because I just feel like it's so
I make it on any interview we do.
Right, like every campaign, it's like affordability, right? And like I'm also guilty of like having yard signs that say affordability now or whatever.
Of course,
right?
because it's the thing, right?
But it really is just like gobbledygook, right? It's like, what's the actual thing, right? So obviously some people are in the season of their lives where childcare is important, and childcare costs more than 1 year of in-state college tuition here in Indiana, right? That's a huge issue. For some, for many, healthcare is something, and I'll come back and tell a story around that. But the two things I hear the most are around utility costs right now and around affordable housing. I put a plan around affordable housing, where I'm not just talking about what I, as a member of Congress, can do at the federal level. Obviously, there's an oversight role, there's a policy and legislative piece there, but I also put forward what I think we should be doing at the state and local level. Obviously not something where I have that authority over, but most people don't know, and certainly nobody cares whether a solution is to come from federal, state, or local. They just want to see their issues solved. And most of these issues, like affordable housing, are extremely complex, so it requires whole of government approach, and different interventions. And so I may not be able to make the mayor consider the use of city-owned land to build affordable housing units, but I can force the conversation. I may not be able to make the governor, and state legislature, look at tenant protections, because Indy is 5th worst in the country in the eviction crisis, but I can force the conversation, right? And so it is about using the platform and the pulpit, because in absence of a governor and a mayor that have any sort of vision for the community, like whoever sits in this seat should put one forward. And I'm not naive to the fact that vision building is really difficult. Rallying people around a vision is even harder, and executing is the hardest. But if you don't have a vision, then you're just walking aimlessly. And I feel like we've been walking aimlessly for far too long here.
I think that's it's so true. Like, we had a candidate from our area in Los Angeles who is running to unseat an incumbent in the area of where the Palisades fire was. And just hearing him talk about, witnessing the kind of, as we all did here in LA, but the breakdown of local, state, and federal government in this crisis, I think it's so true. And I do feel like it's something that sort of new voices like yourself have an opportunity to try to tackle, because for so long government has felt siloed. But you're so right. Like voters we don't see that. We're not saying, and it goes back to what you're saying about your current congressman of, kind of the as you maybe would feel, the misuse of the pulpit or the lack of use of the pulpit to do that. So I think that's really notable for people to understand that, there does need to be that sense of cooperation, even when it might be difficult.
Yeah, I mean, anybody can be an up or down vote on any given issue, right? That's such a baseline, and so I think we fundamentally need to reimagine the role. I mean, one of the things I think about is during the November shutdown, the food stamps lapse, right? And so I'm not even in Congress; I'm just a candidate, and I thought about, hey, how do I use this platform, right, to do good and be of service? And so, I've been able to meet with faith leaders and neighborhood association presidents and community organizers of all different, stripes. And so I thought, all right, this neighborhood association president over here is sitting on some resources and they want to do something, but they don't have, the volunteers and the bodies. This group of folks over here has the passion and the time, but they don't have the resources. I can't force something to happen, but I can put them together, or suggest they get together and see what comes of it. Or we did research on what are the resources that are currently out there, not just in Indy, but across the state, and, pushed an email out to the email list and said, hey, this is a living sheet, crowdsourced. Of anything that exists or that is surfacing in this moment, send it my way. Boom, just like that, 130 entries, right? And so, there's actual power right? We don't have a lot of actual power right now in DC as Democrats, but we always have symbolic power. And so symbolic power is not meaningless. So how do we use that symbolic power in DC? How do we use it at home? Because the baseline is not just being a representative in DC. The baseline is being a representative for your community.
Oh, I love that.
Well, just to sort of wrap up here, I want to ask you one last question. That's kind of a personal question, which is I'm wondering if you can talk about the moment that made you decide to run. I assume you've been around politics for a while. It was maybe something that you were floating, but if you could take us through a little bit that moment of going from, yeah, maybe I'll do this one day to, okay, I'm going to file tomorrow, or whatever that apparatus is.
I mean, honestly, it's, I mean, people have always talked to me about something like this. I never really, I didn't anticipate this for myself. And my poor wife certainly didn't anticipate this.
The real hero.
Right. I mean, she's the MVP. She's been incredibly supportive. And without her, none of this would be possible. But I had started, in the summer of 2024, an organization called Next Gen Hoosiers, because where I see the ripples of hope in the devolving political climate here is not necessarily just in younger leaders, but in newer voices more generally. And we were 4 seats short, and still are, of breaking the Republican supermajority in the state house. And so I figured, okay, on top of, just my job, let me try and, raise money. And even as minimal as it might be, 20,000, whatever it was, do anything to add value and help folks out. And so this was me doing 20 hours of call time a week, to folks in and out of state, not taking anything from it, just like wanting to be helpful. And, we supported, via, paid digital, expenditures, in support of 10 state house candidates. Right. And along the way, one of the things that I would talk to people about was the idea that both this congressional seat and the mayoral seat here in Indianapolis, which is typically held by a Democrat, are the 2 dominoes that need to fall. Because unlike a state party chair, whoever sits in these roles, they have their own personal brands. Unlike Congressman Frank Mervan in Northwest Indiana, a Democrat, these are safe Democratic seats. Unlike Democratic mayors outside of Indianapolis, unlike state house and state, Senate leadership, whoever sits in these seats theoretically has more access to capital. And so having folks in those positions that not only have a baseline vision for the community and the work ethic to execute upon it, but also see themselves as the party builder and the party leader is so incredibly important. Because like I said, back when we were competing, even winning statewide, this district was on top of it. Now you see 37%, of our precinct, chair and vice chair slots are unfilled. And most of the ones that are filled are appointed to party insiders that are disconnected from the grassroots. And they are just appointed, to be a safe vote for the county chair if ever that's needed. People aren't actually doing the work. It's a social club more than it is anything else. And community feels that. These are, and it's not just on the congressman, to be fair, right? We've got safe seats at the council level, at the state ledge level, Congress, mayor. When the election is a foregone conclusion in November and you don't typically have primary challenges, you can get comfortable.
Right.
Getting comfortable doesn't always, but often leads to complacency. If you're an elected official and people feel that you're complacent, then they feel disconnected. That then turns into disillusionment. The longer you're disillusioned, then that turns into disengagement. And it becomes this vicious cycle. And so the thing that I've heard the most in this campaign, oddly enough, is thank you. And I get it now when somebody says it to me. I didn't at the beginning. So I would be like, you're welcome. For what? Right. And they would say, for showing up, for knocking on my door, for calling me, for asking my opinion. And so that I'm always happy to hear that. But at the same time, it deeply frustrates me because this is like the bar is in hell right now. Right. It shouldn't be, that novel, this should be the norm. And we just have to get back to that.
Yeah.
And so I was talking to people about it, and to answer the question, Michael, that people were like, well, you see it so clearly, why not you? And I didn't really have an answer to that.
Yeah.
And so I started exploring this. And
that's the question. I think for so many, why not you? Why, like, why not you? I think that's, especially when you're young, that's like, you got to kind of take those reins. Okay, if you can give us 2 more minutes of your time. I know we're a little bit over, but we do have a little lightning round of questions we've been asking all of our primary candidates, if you'll indulge me. Okay, so a hidden gem of your district that people don't know about.
Keystone Sports Review has probably the best wings, particularly across the board, but I'm a spicy garlic guy. Probably the best ones I've ever had. Yeah.
I love this. Oh my God, I love the specificity. Amazing. Okay, so if you win the upcoming primary, who is your first phone call, assuming that your wife is probably standing next to you? Who's the first person you call?
My campaign chair, Tony Coelho. Who's been a great mentor, and he's used to be a member of Congress back in the day out of California, and he was the first ever elected House Majority Whip, lead sponsor of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and he was actually Al Gore's 2000 presidential campaign chair. So for him to kind of take me under his wing,
that's awesome,
and everything, and be as involved as he's been in this process, it's been it's meant a lot to me.
That's amazing. Wow. Yeah. Talk about mentorship. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. So a podcast or book that is shaping your thinking at the moment.
I'm like a psycho, and I can't not have audio playing. Like I'm one of those people when the Spotify rap comes up and it'll be like, you listen to 150,000 or whatever minutes of things, right? And so I go to sleep always listening to an audible book, or a podcast, right? So on podcasts, that's where I often try and get through osmosis, know what's happening. Bill Simmons, right? Ryan Russillo, Pardon My Take. Book right now I am Richard Ben Kramer's Whatever It Takes, which obviously is a giant one, but
a good title for this state, the moment you're in.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, on that sort of same train, your favorite pump up song.
The song I listen to, this is so embarrassing, before every interview is Trophies by Drake.
Okay, yes.
Yeah. It just gets me high. Yeah. The trumpets at the beginning. Yeah.
Also,
really
that's not embarrassing. There's way more embarrassing songs you could have done. Okay, term limits. Are you in favor of them?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. And tell us what the rest of your day is going to look like today as a person running for Congress and your primary coming up.
Yeah, we'll knock on doors. A good day we'll hit 500 doors a day, right?
Wow.
We're moving away from calls a bit now that it's nice out and it's not winter, people will keep the door open, etc. But we're also thinking in this final 2 weeks it's volume. So I wouldn't have told you that in the final 2 weeks of the campaign I would be spending my days going from strip mall parking lot to strip mall parking lot and grocery store to grocery store, putting cards in driver's side windows, just so we can continue to get it out there. Because if we've done doors, we've done calls, we've done voicemails, we are doing all the house parties and the relational kind of or organic organizing, events, all the things. We're just trying to stack it up and have it feel omnipresent, and people get touched, and of course pay texts and everything like that.
Yeah.
And just touch people in any and every way possible.
Got to get the name out.
So that's going to be the day to day, and until I go to this community event, for the Martindale Brightwood community, talking about what they can still do at this stage in the process of that fight against the data center coming into their community.
Amazing. Got to hustle.
Wow.
No, absolutely.
Well, thank you for being here. This was such a great conversation, and Cinco de Mayo, we're going to be watching the returns, and we'll be crossing our fingers and toes for you. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you all for the time and for this work that you're doing. It's incredibly important.
All right. Well, thank you. Good luck in the primary.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.
All right.